In the rigid world of corporate America, an executive finds his mother being helped by a young homeless man. This unlikely encounter reopens old wounds and exposes truths he never wanted to face. What begins as a momentary inconvenience transforms into a journey of reconnection that changes their lives forever. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's get started. I promise, this will be the best story you'll ever hear. A fine October mist coated Park Avenue, like a transparent veil, creating that characteristic silver sheen on the mirrored glass of the office towers. Inside one of the most imposing skyscrapers in the area, Richard Miller was adjusting his tie for the third time that morning. His fingers, normally steady and precise, trembled imperceptibly. At 42, he prided himself on never showing nervousness, but this meeting was different. The Japanese investors waiting in the conference room held the power to decide the future of Miller Consulting, the firm he had built over the last 15 years with sweat, sacrifice, and a determination that bordered on obsession. Richard looked at his reflection in the executive washroom mirror. The tailored navy blue suit, the short, impeccably styled hair, the clean-shaven face. Everything was in its place. Everything was under control. That's how he liked it. Predictable, measurable, no surprises. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the conference room with the posture of a man born to lead. 3 hours later, when the last signature was on the contracts, Richard felt the adrenaline rush that only major victories brought. The Japanese had accepted the proposal. The expansion into the Asian market was secured. His company would double in size over the next 2 years. Formal handshakes, discreet bows, and restrained smiles sealed the deal. As soon as the conference room door closed behind the investors, Richard allowed himself a genuine smile. Victory, another one. He took the elevator down to the ground floor, greeting employees with brief professional nods. No one should notice his euphoria. Successful executives didn't celebrate publicly. They guarded their achievements with the same discretion they used to hide their vulnerabilities. As he crossed the building's lobby, Richard checked his watch. 4:30 in the afternoon. Still time to stop by the accounting firm before the end of the day. It was when he pushed through the revolving door and stepped onto the sidewalk that the scene unfolded before him. A few yards away, near a bus stop, an elderly woman was stumbling, leaning precariously on her cane. Richard immediately recognized the beige coat she was wearing, the one he had bought her last Christmas. Helen, his mother. But what was she doing here, alone, in the middle of Park Avenue? And why was she being supported by that young man in tattered clothes, with disheveled hair and a ripped backpack slung over his shoulder? Richard's heart pounded, but not from the thrill of victory. A strange, unsettling feeling tightened in his chest. The young man was holding his mother's arm gently, guiding her toward a nearby bench. Helen was smiling at him, saying something Richard couldn't hear. The kid responded, nodding with an expression of care that seemed too genuine to be real. Richard crossed the street without looking, ignoring the horn of a taxi that nearly hit him. His steps were fast, determined, fueled by an anger he didn't know the source of. "Mom, what's going on here?" Richard's voice came out louder than he intended, cutting through the city's hum. Helen looked up, and for a brief moment, Richard saw something in her eyes that threw him off. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy at seeing him. It was embarrassment, maybe even fear. "Richard, honey, I can explain." Her voice was frail, almost inaudible over the sound of traffic. The young man immediately let go of Helen's arm as if he'd been burned. He lowered his head and took a few steps back, muttering an apology that Richard barely heard. "Who are you? What do you want with my mother?" Richard practically spat the words, positioning himself between the young man and Helen. His voice was laced with suspicion and authority, the same tone he used to intimidate competitors in tough negotiations. The young man raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Sir, I was just helping her. She almost fell back there on the corner, and I didn't ask what you were doing, I asked who you are." Richard took a step forward, invading the kid's personal space. He could smell the faint odor of sweat and dampness coming from him. He probably hadn't showered in days. "Richard, stop!" Helen's voice was firm for the first time. Cole wasn't doing anything wrong. He helped me. Richard turned to his mother, incredulous. Cole, you know this... He didn't finish the sentence, but the disdain was clear in his tone. The young man, Cole, picked up his backpack from the ground and started to walk away, but Helen reached out as if to stop him. No, Cole, wait. You don't have to go. But the kid was already walking quickly toward the subway, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians that flooded the avenue at that hour. Richard took his mother's arm, firmer than he'd like to admit. Let's go, I'm taking you home. Helen pulled her arm away, trying to free herself. I don't want to go home. What do you mean you don't want to? Mom, what's going on? Why are you out here alone? Where's Brenda? Brenda was the private nurse Richard had hired 6 months ago to take care of Helen full-time. The elderly woman took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. Her eyes, which had seemed so fragile and submissive moments before, now shone with an intensity Richard hadn't seen in years. I ran away, Richard. I ran away from that prison. You call an apartment. The words landed like bombs on the sidewalk. Richard felt as if the ground had opened up beneath him. Prison? Mum, what are you talking about? You have everything there. Comfort, security, medical care. I have loneliness, son. I have walls. I have silence. Helen's voice trembled, but there was a firmness in it that scared Richard. You locked me in that apartment like I was a valuable piece of furniture, too precious to be out in the open. Brenda is an excellent professional, but she's not a companion, she's an employee. She does her job, and that's it. And you show up once a week, stay for half an hour, check if I'm still alive, and then you leave. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. I work a lot, Mom. You know that. I do what I can. You do what's convenient, Richard, not what's necessary. Helen sat down on the bench, her cane trembling in her hand. That boy, Cole, he listens to me. He talks to me. He treats me like a person, not an obligation. Mom, you don't know this kid. He could be a con artist, a hustler. People like that prey on vulnerable people. Vulnerable? Helen let out a bitter laugh. You want to know what's vulnerable, son? It's waking up every day in a silent apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering if anyone in the world still cares if you're alive. It's having a nurse who charts everything you eat, everything you feel, but never asks you how your day was. It's having a son who pays for everything but never has time to sit down and listen to a story. The words cut like sharp blades. Richard felt the anger being replaced by something worse. Guilt, but he fought against it, clinging to his relentless logic. I'm protecting you, Mom. The world out there is dangerous. You could fall, you could get mugged, you could... Could live? Helen interrupted him. Richard, I'm 78 years old. I raised you by myself after your father left us. I worked as a seamstress for 30 years to put food on the table and give you an education. I'm not a porcelain doll. I'm a woman who still wants to feel the sun on her face, to walk the streets, to talk to people. Richard sat down next to her on the bench, suddenly exhausted. The victory from the meeting already felt like it had happened in another lifetime. He looked at his mother, really looked at her. For the first time in months, the wrinkles around her eyes seemed deeper. Her white hair was tied in a simple bun, but loose strands were being tossed by the wind. Her hands, once so skilled with a needle and thread, now trembled slightly. You ran away? Richard's voice was low, almost incredulous. Every afternoon. When Brenda goes to the grocery store, Helen answered with a hint of childish rebellion. I take the service elevator down, walk to Washington Square Park, and I just sit there. Sometimes I just watch people. Other times I talk to whoever comes along. That's dangerous, Mom. That's living, son. She looked directly into his eyes. It was on one of those afternoons that I met Cole. I tripped on a tree root and fell. He was sitting on a bench sketching. He helped me up, got my cane, brushed off my coat. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just helped me. Richard pressed his lips together. And you started meeting him? Yes, almost. Every day. He tells me about the places he slept, about the dreams he still has. I tell him about what New York used to be like, about the neighborhood where I grew up, about your father. Helen smiled sadly. You know, Richard, he calls me Mrs. Helen, but he also calls me Grandma. Says he never had a real grandma. And I never had a grandchild. The sentence hung in the air like a silent accusation. Richard and his ex-wife never had children. It was a choice, he always said. They didn't have time to raise a child. His career was taking off. But maybe deep down he just didn't know how to be a father. Just like apparently he didn't know how to be a son. "Mum, Richard started, but he didn't know how to finish. The words that normally flowed so easily in business meetings now seemed stuck in his throat. "You don't have to say anything, son. I know you care in your own way, but your way is cold. It's distant. It's practical." Helen placed her hand on his. "When you were little, you used to tell me everything. Your fears, your dreams, your disappointments. But as you grew up, you closed yourself off. You built walls so high that even I couldn't get through." Richard felt his eyes sting. How long had it been since he'd cried? 5 years? 10? Since the divorce, maybe. But not here. Not in the middle of Park Avenue with hundreds of people passing by, each absorbed in their own problems. "I want to find Cole again," Helen said, her voice full of determination. "I want to apologize for how you acted. He didn't deserve to be treated like that. Mom, you barely know the guy. How can you be so sure his intentions are good?" "The same way you're so sure they're bad, Richard. Instinct." She stood up, leaning on her cane. "The difference is, my instinct comes from hope. Yours comes from fear." The words hit Richard with the force of a punch. Fear. Was that what he felt? No, he thought. It was prudence. It was responsibility. It was... But deep down, maybe it was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of the unknown. Fear that someone might hurt the person he loved, even if he himself didn't know how to show that love properly. "Let's go home, Mom. We can talk about this calmly." "No, I'm not going back to that cage. Not until I find Cole and explain." Helen started walking toward the subway, her steps slow but determined. Richard followed her, torn between frustration and a flicker of admiration. His mother had always been strong, he knew that, but in recent years, after she became more physically frail, he had treated her as if her mind had weakened too, as if she needed to be protected from herself. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help you find him, but after that you're coming home and we're going to talk about all of this." Helen stopped and looked at her son. For the first time that afternoon, a soft smile appeared on her face. "Thank you, Richard." They walked together down the avenue, passing shops, restaurants, newsstands. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and clean. Richard realized he hadn't walked with his mother like this, without a rush, without a corporate destination, in years, maybe a decade. "Where do you usually find him?" Richard asked, trying to sound less hostile. "In Washington Square Park. He stays near the fountain, usually sketching or reading a book he found in the trash." Helen spoke with familiarity, as if describing an old friend. "He sketches?" "Very well. Faces, landscapes, buildings. He has an incredible talent. Said he'd like to study architecture someday." Richard absorbed the information in silence. Architecture. So the kid had dreams, aspirations. He wasn't just a nameless drifter. That somehow made everything more complicated. It would be easier to despise him if he were just another invisible person on the streets. But a young man with talent, with dreams, that humanized him in a way Richard wasn't prepared to handle. They took the subway at the 59th Street station, descending the escalators into the late afternoon crowd. Richard hadn't been on the subway in years. He always used a car service or a taxi. The smell, the pushing and shoving, the suffocating heat of the crowded platform. It all irritated him deeply. But his mother, who lived in a luxury apartment paid for by him, came down here almost every day to meet a homeless kid. The car was packed. Richard stood next to his mother, who got a seat thanks to the kindness of a young man in a baseball cap. During the ride, Richard observed the people around him. Tired workers heading home, students with headphones on, street vendors selling candy and chocolates. A parallel universe to his own, one that existed daily, but that he had chosen to ignore. They got off at the West 4th Street station and walked to the park. The sun was setting. painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The park was moderately full. Children played near the benches while their parents chatted. A few skateboarders practiced tricks on the steps, and scattered in the corners, homeless people were setting up their makeshift camps for the night. Helen scanned the park with her eyes, searching for the young man. Richard followed her, feeling strangely out of place. Here he was, Richard Miller, successful executive, owner of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, walking through Washington Square Park, looking for a homeless kid his mother had befriended. There, Helen pointed toward the fountain. A young man with messy brown hair was sitting on the ground, his back against a tattered backpack, sketching something in an old notebook. It was him, Cole. Richard's stomach tightened. Part of him wanted to turn around and drag his mother back home. But another part, a part he didn't recognize, was curious. Who was this kid who had managed to win Helen's affection in a way her own son couldn't? Helen walked toward the young man with steps quicker than she should have. Cole looked up from his notebook, and when he saw her, a smile lit up his face. But then he saw Richard behind her, and the smile vanished. He quickly started gathering his things. "Cole, wait. Please," Helen pleaded, holding out her hand. The kid hesitated but stayed where he was. Richard could see him better. Now, he must have been about 19, 20. His face was young, but his eyes carried a maturity that only comes from hardship. He was wearing ripped jeans, a faded rock band t-shirt, and a worn-out military jacket. His sneakers were frayed, with holes in the sides. "Mrs. Helen, you shouldn't have come, I get it. Your son doesn't want me around you. It's okay, The kid's voice was gentle, resigned. "It's not okay, Cole. It's not." Helen sat on the ground next to him, completely ignoring the fact that she was dirtying the expensive coat her son had given her. "My son was rude to you, and I came to apologize." Richard remained standing, watching the scene with a mixture of discomfort and something that might have been shame. Cole shook his head. "You don't have to apologize. I know how I look. I know what people think when they see me. Your son was just protecting you. I'd do the same thing if I were him." The maturity in the kid's words took Richard by surprise. There was no resentment, no anger, just acceptance. "But he was wrong," Helen insisted. "You're my friend, Cole. You helped me when I needed it. You listened to me when no one else would. And I won't let anyone, not even my son, treat you badly for it." Richard felt like he'd been slapped. His mother's words hurt more than he wanted to admit. But they were true. Every single one. Cole looked at Richard for the first time since they'd arrived. His eyes were a light brown, almost hazel, and they had a depth that was unsettling. It was as if he could see through the masks Richard wore so well. "Sir," Cole began, his voice respectful, "I understand your concern. If I had a mother, I'd protect her too. But I swear I've never asked Mrs. Helen for anything, never taken money. I just talked to her, that's all." Richard swallowed hard. This was the moment to maintain his posture, to reassert his authority, to make it clear he didn't accept this situation. But when he opened his mouth, the words that came out surprised him. "I was rude, and maybe I jumped to conclusions." He looked at his mother, who had tears in her eyes. "My mother is very important to me, and I don't want to see her get hurt." "Neither do I, sir," Cole answered, with a sincerity that was impossible to doubt. "Mrs. Helen reminds me of someone I wish I'd had in my life, someone who would listen without judging, who would see me as a person, not a problem." The words hung in the air between the three of them. The park continued its routine around them, but there, in that small circle, a connection was forming. Fragile, unlikely, but real. Helen wiped her tears and smiled. "Why don't the three of us talk? There's a diner nearby. We can get some coffee, something to eat." Cole looked down at his dirty clothes and shook his head. "Mrs. Helen, I can't go into places like that. They'll kick me out." "Not if I'm with you," Richard heard himself say, surprising himself. "Let's go." And so, the three of them walked together through the park toward a small diner on the corner. Richard Miller, the impeccable executive, Helen, the mother who had fled her golden cage, and Cole, the invisible young man who had somehow become visible to the right people. At that moment, none of them knew it yet, but something had shifted. A door had opened, and through it each of them would have the chance to see the world and themselves in a completely new way. Night was falling over New York, bringing with it the city lights, and in that simple diner, around a Formica table, 3 lives were beginning to intertwine in ways none of them could have predicted. The diner smelled of fresh coffee and toast on the griddle. It was one of those old places that bravely resisted the gentrification of downtown Manhattan, with a stained marble counter, red plastic chairs, and a TV, tuned to the evening news. Celia, the owner, a robust woman in a floral apron, shot a suspicious glance at Cole when the 3 of them walked in, but upon seeing Helen holding the young man's arm with motherly affection, her expression softened. Richard ordered 3 coffees and a basket of warm rolls. They sat at a table in the corner, near the window overlooking the street illuminated by yellowish streetlights. Cole seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his chair, avoiding looking directly at Richard. His hands were smudged with graphite from the sketch he'd been doing in the park, and he hid them under the table as if ashamed. "You can relax, Cole," Helen said, placing her hand on his. "No one's going to judge you here." The kid nodded, but Richard could see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't comfortable either. This whole situation was strange, outside of his usual control, but there was something in his mother's expression, a light in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time, that made him stay. "So," Richard began, trying to sound less intimidating, "my mother told me you're a good artist." Cole looked up, surprised by the attempt at conversation. "I try, sir. I'm self-taught just by watching, practicing." "Can I see?" Richard held out his hand, gesturing toward the backpack where Cole had put his notebook. The young man hesitated, but Helen encouraged him with a nod. Slowly, Cole took the notebook from his backpack. It was a standard school notebook with a worn spiral and yellowed pages. He opened it to the last few pages and handed it to Richard carefully, as if he were handing over something precious. Richard examined the drawings. They were done in pencil, some in pen, and depicted scenes of the city. St. Patrick's Cathedral with its precise architectural details, the Brooklyn Bridge with its hurried pedestrians, faces of people Cole must have observed in the park, each with distinct expressions, alive despite being just lines on paper. There was talent there, real talent. "These are very good," Richard said, and this time he wasn't just being polite. "You really learned all this on your own?" "Yes, sir. I've always loved to draw. When I was little, I lived in a shelter near the Lower East Side. There was a volunteer librarian who would give me old architecture magazines. I'd spend hours copying the buildings." Cole's voice came alive when he talked about drawing, as if it were his safe territory. "And your parents?" Richard asked, and immediately regretted it when he saw the look that crossed the young man's face. Cole was silent for a moment. Helen squeezed his hand gently, a silent gesture of support. "I lost them both when I was 8, Cole said finally, his voice low but steady. "Car accident on I-80 in Pennsylvania. My dad was a truck driver. My mom always went with him on his trips. I stayed with an aunt, but she couldn't afford to raise me. I ended up in the shelter system." Richard felt a pang in his chest. 8 years old, the same age he was when his father left, but at least he'd had his mother. Cole had lost everything at once. "I'm very sorry," Richard said, and for the first time that night his voice was stripped of all formality. "It was a long time ago. I've learned to deal with it." Cole shrugged, but Richard could see the pain was still there, just well hidden. "I was in the system until I was 16, then I ran away." "And why?" Helen asked softly. "There was a staff member there who wasn't a good person. He'd hit the younger boys, humiliate us, tell us we'd never amount to anything." Cole pressed his lips together, as if trying to contain old emotions. "One day, he tore up all my drawings in front of everyone, saying I was wasting my time on nonsense. That's when I left. I preferred the streets." Richard felt anger rising inside him. Anger at that unknown staff member who had crushed a boy's dreams. Anger at a system that had failed to protect a child. Anger at himself for judging Cole so quickly without knowing his story. "And you've been on the streets ever since?" Richard asked. 3 years now. I sleep wherever I can, work when I can find it. I've been a construction helper, a market loader, handed out flyers. Nothing steady, nothing on the books because I lost my ID a while back and haven't been able to get a new one. Cole spoke without self-pity, just stating facts. But I save what I can, keep it in a safe place. One day I'll have enough to rent a room, get my documents, try to go to school. You want to study architecture? Richard asked, remembering what his mother had mentioned. Cole's eyes lit up. That's the dream. I think it's amazing how buildings can change people's lives, you know? How a well-designed space can make someone feel at home, safe. I want to create places like that, places where people like me could feel like they belong. Richard was silent, processing the words. There was a depth to this young man he hadn't expected, a wisdom born of pain but tempered with hope. Celia brought the coffees and the rolls. Cole looked at the food with obvious hunger, but waited politely for the others to start. Helen pushed the plate toward him. Eat, honey. It's okay. Cole ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a gourmet meal. Richard realized it was probably the kid's first decent meal of the day, maybe in several days. Cole, Richard began, and the young man looked up, still chewing. Why did you help my mother that day? And why did you keep meeting with her? Cole finished swallowing before he answered. Because she treated me like a person. When I helped her, she looked me in the eye and thanked me for real. Not with pity, not with fear, with sincere gratitude. He looked at Helen with affection. And when we talked, she really listened. She told me stories about her life, asked about mine. It had been a long time since anyone cared about what I had to say. Helen wiped away a tear that was rolling down her cheek. You saved me too, Cole. You saved me from loneliness. You made me feel useful again, important in someone's life. Richard felt as if he were watching from the outside. Here was his mother, the woman he thought he was protecting by locking her in a luxury apartment, revealing that she felt useless. And here was a homeless kid who had managed to see what her own son couldn't, her need to be heard, to feel alive. Mom, Richard said, his voice hoarse, I didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you ever tell me? Helen smiled sadly. I tried, son, but you were always busy, always in a hurry, always with your head in spreadsheets and meetings, and I didn't want to be another problem on your to-do list. The words hit Richard squarely. That was exactly how he treated everything, including his mother, like items on a checklist. Visit mom, check. Pay the nurse, check. Monthly prescriptions, check. But he never stopped to actually be present, to listen, to see beyond the surface. I'm so sorry, Richard said, and for the first time in years he felt his eyes well up. I thought I was doing what was best for you, that by giving you comfort and security, I was doing my part. You were, son. But comfort and security don't replace affection. They don't replace presence. Helen reached for his hand across the table. I know you care. I know everything you do comes from a place of love. But love also needs time. It needs attention. It needs vulnerability. Vulnerability. The word Richard feared most. In his corporate world, vulnerability was weakness. It was giving ammunition to competitors. It was losing control. But maybe with the people who mattered, vulnerability was something else. It was connection. I want to try, Richard said, squeezing his mother's hand. I want to try to do better, to be better. Cole watched the scene in silence with the expression of someone witnessing something intimate and precious. When Richard looked at him, the kid gave a small smile. Mrs. Helen is special, sir. You're lucky to still have her. The simplicity of the words carried the weight of someone who had lost his parents too soon. Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. They stayed in the diner for over 2 hours, talking. Helen told stories of Richard's childhood, the mischief he got into, the dreams he had. Richard, in turn, asked more about Cole's life, about his days on the streets, about his dreams, and Cole, little by little, began to open up, sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in a long time. When they finally left, the night was cool and the starry sky was a rare sight in New York due to the light pollution, but a few stubborn stars shone through. Cole started to say his goodbyes, adjusting his backpack. "Where are you going to sleep?" Richard asked. "There's a spot under the Williamsburg Bridge approach. It's kind of sheltered from the wind," Cole said matter-of-factly, as if mentioning a residential address. Richard looked at his mother, then at the kid. Something inside him had changed in those last few hours. Not a drastic change, but a crack in the armor he had built over the years. And through that crack, something human was beginning to emerge. "No, you're coming with me," Richard said, surprising himself. Cole frowned. "Sir? I have an empty guest suite in my building. You can stay there tonight. Take a hot shower, sleep in a decent bed. Tomorrow we'll talk about what to do next." Cole looked at Helen, as if seeking confirmation that this was real. She was smiling through tears, nodding for him to accept. "I can't accept, sir. That's too much." "You can and you will," Richard said firmly, but this time his voice didn't carry imposing authority, just sincere determination. "My mother trusts you, and if she trusts you, I'm going to learn to trust you too." Cole was silent for a long moment. Richard could see the internal battle playing out behind those hazel eyes. Pride, suspicion, hope, and fear mingled in his expression. "For one night, then," Cole said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "Just for one night." Richard smiled. "We'll see. Maybe you'll change your mind." They took a cab back to Midtown East, where both Helen's and Richard's apartments were. On the way, the elderly woman fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting on her son's shoulder. Cole stared out the window, watching the city he knew so well from the streets, but was now seeing from inside a car, on his way to a warm, safe place. First, they dropped Helen off at her apartment. Richard went up with her, dismissed the nurse Brenda for the rest of the night, and helped his mother get settled. Before leaving, she held his face in her hands like she used to when he was a child. "I'm proud of you, son, for what you did today, for what you're trying to do." Richard kissed her forehead. "I'm the one who should have been taking better care of you a long time ago, but I'm going to get better, I promise." "Take care of Cole," she asked. "He's a good boy. He just needs a chance." "I will, Mum. Get some rest." On the way to his own building, a few blocks away, Richard and Cole were silent. The kid still seemed to be in shock, processing everything that had happened that day. Richard's guest suite was simple but comfortable. A bedroom with a queen-sized bed, a full bathroom, a small living area with a sofa and a TV. Cole walked in slowly, as if afraid to touch anything. "The bathroom's over there. There are clean towels in the closet. I'll get you some clean clothes. They'll probably be big on you, but it's better than nothing," Richard said, already heading for the door. "Mr. Miller," Cole called out, making him stop. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Richard thought for a moment before answering. "Because my mother is right about a lot of things, and because I've spent so much time building walls that I forgot what it's like to be on the other side of them. You and my mother reminded me of that today." Cole nodded slowly. "I'll be gone early tomorrow, before I'm in the way." "You're not in the way, and you're not leaving before we have breakfast together. It's the least I can do." Richard gave a half smile. "Now go take that shower before I change my mind." Cole smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Thank you, seriously, thank you." Richard went back to his own apartment, which was on the same floor. It was a large, modern space decorated by an interior designer he barely knew. Everything was impeccable but cold, lifeless, soulless. He had never noticed that before. He gathered some clothes for Cole, a pair of sweatpants, a t-shirt, a hoodie, all new or nearly new. When he returned to the guest suite 20 minutes later, he found Cole, freshly showered, using a towel as a robe, his hair still wet. "Here, put these on. We'll figure out what to do with your clothes tomorrow," Richard said, handing him the items. "Mr. Miller, I can wash my clothes and—" "Enough with the Mr. Miller. Call me Richard, and just take the clothes before I throw yours in the trash." There was humor in Richard's voice, something that rarely surfaced. Cole took the clothes carefully. "Thank you, Richard." "You're welcome. There's food in the fridge if you get hungry, and we'll talk more tomorrow, about you, about plans, about how we can really help you." "Why do you want to help me?" Cole asked again, as if he needed to be sure this was real. Richard took a deep breath. "Because today I realized I've been a terrible son, and maybe by helping you I can become a slightly better person for my mother, for myself, and who knows, for you too." He left the suite before Cole could answer, before his own long-suppressed emotions could overflow. Back in his apartment, Richard poured himself a whiskey and sat on the Italian leather sofa, looking out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. New York pulsed below, indifferent to the personal dramas of its inhabitants, millions of stories happening simultaneously, intertwining, separating, transforming. He thought about his mother, about how he had failed to truly see her. He thought about Cole, about everything the kid had been through and yet still held onto hope and kindness. He thought about himself, about his meticulously constructed but emotionally empty life. His phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his partners asking about the contracts with the Japanese. Richard looked at the message, then at the glass of whiskey in his hand, then at the city outside. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't reply immediately. He turned off his phone and just sat there thinking, feeling, allowing himself to be vulnerable, even if only with himself. Across the hall, Cole lay down in a real bed for the first time in 3 years. The clean clothes smelled of fabric softener, a scent he barely remembered. The pillow was soft, the comforter warm. He stared at the white ceiling, still unable to believe that this day had actually happened. He thought of Helen, of her kindness, of the genuine affection she offered without asking for anything in return. He thought of Richard, of the transformation he had witnessed in that rigid man over the course of a few hours. He thought of himself, of the dreams he still carried despite everything. And for the first time in a long time, Cole allowed himself to hope. Not just the abstract hope for a better future, but a concrete hope. Maybe, just maybe, things really could change. As the city slept outside, 2 men in different apartments, separated only by a hallway but by entire universes of experience, closed their eyes with similar thoughts. Thoughts about connection, about family, about the possibility of a new beginning. Helen, in her apartment a few blocks away, slept with a smile on her face. Because for the first time in a long time, she felt she had a purpose, that her life still mattered, that her days could still make a difference. And somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, the 3 of them dreamed. Different dreams, but intertwined. Dreams of a future yet to be built, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, gesture by gesture. The morning would bring new challenges, new difficult conversations, new decisions to be made. But for now, on that October night in New York, 3 lives had found each other, and nothing would ever be the same. The aroma of fresh coffee woke. Cold before the sun had fully risen. For a few seconds, still wrapped in the soft comforter, he thought he was dreaming. But then he opened his eyes and saw the white ceiling, the linen curtains filtering the dawn light, the light wood door of the built-in closet. It was real. He had actually slept in a bed in a clean, warm apartment. He got up slowly, still wearing the clothes Richard had given him. They were big, but comfortable. Looking at himself in the bathroom mirror, Cole almost didn't recognize himself. His face was clean, his hair combed, his eyes less tired. He looked like a different person. Or maybe, he thought, he finally looked like the person he could have been if life had been different. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Richard, already dressed for work in a dark grey suit, but with a different expression than the day before. Less rigid, more human. "Good morning. Sleep well?" Richard asked. "Better than I have in years, Richard." "Thank you," Cole answered sincerely. "Good. Come have breakfast with me. My mother is on her way over." Breakfast was served on the balcony of Richard's apartment, which offered a privileged view of the New York skyline. Helen arrived shortly after, brought by Richard himself, who had gone to pick her up. She wore a simple floral dress, and her eyes shone with joy. "Cole, it's so good to see you here." She hugged him with the affection of a grandmother embracing her grandson. The three sat at a table laden with fresh bread, fruit, juices, cheeses, and cold cuts. Cole ate politely, but Richard noticed how he savored every bite, how he discreetly tucked 2 small rolls into his pocket. The gesture broke his heart. "Cole, you don't have to save food. Eat as much as you want. And if you want to take something for later, just ask," Richard said gently. The young man blushed, embarrassed. "Sorry, it's a habit from the street. You never know when your next meal will be. You don't have to apologize. I just want you to know that you're safe here." Richard poured him more juice. Helen looked at her son with pride. This wasn't the Richard she knew, or rather, it was the Richard she always knew existed behind the corporate armor, just waiting to emerge. "Cole," Richard began, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "yesterday you mentioned you lost your documents. That prevents you from getting a formal job, right?" "Yeah. Without a state ID and a social security card, no one will hire me on the books, just odd jobs. What if I helped you get replacements? Would you be up for that?" Cole's eyes widened. "Of course I would. But it's expensive, and you need proof of residence, a birth certificate." "Leave that to me. I have contacts who can speed up the process." Richard took out a notepad and started writing. "We'll need some information. Do you remember where you were born? Your parents' full names?" Cole provided the information, his voice trembling slightly as he mentioned his parents. Helen held his hand, offering the silent comfort only she could give. "And what about school?" Helen asked. "What grade did you finish?" "I finished middle school at the shelter, but I never got to do high school. I had to work to survive." Richard jotted everything down, his mind already working on possibilities, on solutions. This was how he functioned best, solving problems, creating strategies. But this time, it wasn't to close a deal or beat a competitor. It was to change someone's life, and that made all the difference. "There's a way for you to get your high school equivalency through the GED program. And after that, if you really want to study architecture, we can think about college," Richard said, and saw Cole's eyes fill with tears. "Richard, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever imagined possible." "Just say you'll work hard, that you'll take this chance," Richard replied. "I will, I swear I will." Cole wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "But I don't want to be a charity case. I want to give back somehow, to work, to help with something." Helen smiled. "See, Richard, I told you he was special." Richard was thoughtful for a moment. Then, as if a light had switched on in his mind, he looked at Cole with a new intensity. "What if you helped my mother?" he suggested. "She needs companionship, someone who can go on walks with her, talk to her. The nurse takes care of her health, but you could take care of her heart. And in return, you'd have a place to stay, food and time to study." Helen clapped her hands, excited. "Richard, what a wonderful idea. Cole, would you accept? It would be like having a grandson living with me." Cole looked from one to the other, incredulous. "Are you serious?" "I could live with Mrs. Helen." "Why not? Her apartment has 2 bedrooms. One is empty. You'd have your own space, your privacy, and my mother would have company." Richard was already mentally rearranging the logistics. "Of course, we'd have to set some rules, a routine, and you'd have to commit to your studies." "I'll commit to everything. Studies, companionship, whatever it takes," Cole was beaming. "But Richard, this is too much. Why are you doing all this for me?" Richard took a deep breath. "Because yesterday, I realized I've spent years taking care of my mother the wrong way. I gave her money, comfort, security, but I didn't give her presence. In a few days, you gave her what I couldn't give her in years, genuine attention. If you stay with her, you'll both be helping each other. And I'll learn to be a better son." Helen stood up and hugged her son, crying. "You're already a good son, Richard. You were just lost, but you're finding your way." The 3 of them stood there on the balcony, under the morning sun, united by an affection that transcended biological ties. It was a family being formed not by blood, but by choice, by empathy, by love. In the following weeks, the lives of the 3 changed drastically. Richard hired a lawyer to expedite Cole's documents. He enrolled the young man in an evening GED program at a school near Helen's apartment. He bought him clothes, school supplies, a used but functional laptop. Cole moved into the spare room in Helen's apartment. On the first day, he arranged his few possessions with reverent care, as if each object were precious. His sketchbooks, a few books he'd found over the years, a faded photo of his parents. Helen helped him set everything up, talking, telling stories, turning that sterile room into a home. A routine established itself naturally. Cole would wake up early, have breakfast with Helen, then go to the public library to study. In the afternoon, he'd return, and the two would walk together through Washington Square Park, talking about everything and nothing. At night, Cole went to school, and Helen would wait up for him with a snack ready for when he got back. Richard started visiting more frequently, not just quick drop-ins to check if everything was okay, but real visits. Dinners that stretched for hours, deep conversations about life, regrets, and dreams. He discovered facets of his mother he never knew, stories from when she was young, how she met his father, the sacrifices she made to raise him alone. And he also discovered who Cole really was. An intelligent, observant young man with an impressive ability to understand people. His grades in school were excellent. He devoured books on architecture that Richard bought, taking detailed notes, creating imaginary projects in his notebooks. One evening, 3 months after Cole moved in with Helen, the three were having dinner when the young man made a proposal that would change everything. "I was thinking," Cole began a bit hesitantly, "you've helped me so much. You've completely changed my life. And I keep thinking about how many people out there are in the situation I was in. Young people without family, without opportunities, and how many elderly people are alone, feeling useless, invisible, like Mrs. Helen felt." Richard and Helen listened in silence, curious. What if we created something that connected these two ends? A project that connects lonely seniors with vulnerable young people, not as charity, but as an exchange. The seniors get companionship, purpose, someone to care for. The young people get guidance, affection, a temporary home while they get on their feet. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Richard felt something ignite within him. It was brilliant, it was audacious. It was exactly the kind of thing he would have never thought of on his own, trapped in his corporate logic. "Chosen family," Helen murmured. "We could call it that, because it's not about blood. It's about choosing to love, choosing to care." Richard stood up, pacing the room, his mind already processing the idea in detail. This could work. Legally, it would have to be well structured. We'd need psychologists to screen both parties, social workers to follow up, lawyers to create contracts that protect everyone involved. But would it work? Cole asked, hopeful. It would do more than work. It could transform lives, many lives. Richard turned to them, his eyes shining with an excitement he hadn't felt in years, not for profit or a business conquest, but for something bigger. "I can use my company's resources, create a specific department for this, hire professionals, seek partnerships with the city." Helen clasped her hands, emotional. "We could help so many people. And show that family isn't just who you're born with, it's who you choose to walk with," Cole added. That night, the three of them stayed up late planning. Cole drew diagrams showing how the process could work. Helen contributed insights on what seniors really needed, based on her own experience. Richard took notes, already thinking about costs, logistics, necessary partnerships. When they finally said goodnight, it was past midnight, but none of them were tired. They were energized, connected by a common purpose. The next day, Richard called an extraordinary meeting with his partners. He presented the chosen family idea, not as a charity project, but as a social responsibility initiative that would add value to the company's brand. Some partners were skeptical, questioning the financial return. But Richard argued with passion, using data on the aging population, youth homelessness, and the social impact such a program could have. "This isn't about immediate profit," he said, looking each partner in the eye. "It's about legacy. It's about using our resources to create real change. And yes, it's also about marketing, about positioning our company as a leader in social innovation. But mostly, it's about doing the right thing." After hours of debate, the proposal was approved. Richard would have 6 months and a limited budget to create a pilot project. If it worked, the company would expand the program. In the following months, Richard worked more intensely than he ever had before. But for the first time, he wasn't driven by ambition or competitiveness. He was driven by purpose. He hired psychologists specializing in geriatrics and at-risk youth. He forged partnerships with shelters, nursing homes, and city agencies. He created safety protocols, screening processes, and training for everyone involved. Cole participated actively whenever he could, between his classes and studies. He had valuable insights, practical suggestions born from his experience on the streets. And Helen became the project's informal ambassador, visiting senior groups telling her story, showing firsthand how her connection with Cole had transformed her life. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Richard faced resistance. Some professionals in the field questioned its viability. Families, of seniors, were suspicious of scams. Young people in shelters were wary of the intentions. There were moments of discouragement, like when the first attempt at a match failed. An 85-year-old woman and a 20-year-old man couldn't connect. Their personalities were incompatible. It was Cole who reminded Richard that not every attempt would succeed, that the important thing was to keep adjusting, learning. "You didn't close every deal you proposed, did you?" Cole asked, using Richard's own language. "No, some failed." "But you didn't stop doing business, did you?" "No." "So why would you give up on this? Something so much more important than any contract." The young man's wisdom, born from loss and perseverance, guided Richard through the obstacles. And slowly, adjustments were made. The screening processes became more refined, the psychological support more frequent, the training more comprehensive, and then came the first success: a 72-year-old widow and an 18-year-old girl who had run away from home due to complicated family issues. They connected immediately. The woman, a former teacher, helped the girl get back to her studies. The girl, full of energy, brought new life into the woman's quiet house. Two solitudes that found and completed each other. When Richard visited them 3 months after the match, what he saw moved him deeply. They were laughing together in the kitchen, baking a cake. They talked about everything, from recipes to future aspirations. There was genuine affection there. There was family. "It works," he murmured to himself, watching the scene. "It really works." More matches followed, each one unique, each with its own challenges and victories. A widowed gentleman who taught woodworking to a boy who dreamed of making furniture. A woman who never had children and a young woman who never knew her mother, now sharing not just a roof but stories, dreams, and meals. The project began to get media attention. Small articles in local papers turned into reports on national networks. Helen was interviewed several times, always with Cole by her side, telling how it all began. Their story touched hearts, inspired people. One night, 6 months after the pilot project began, Richard presented the results to the board. 10 successful matches, dozens of candidates in the screening process, positive feedback from all involved, interest from other cities in replicating the model, and most importantly, transformed lives. The board approved not only the continuation, but the expansion of Chosen Family. More resources, more staff, more reach. When he left the meeting, Richard immediately called his mother. "They approved it, Mom. They approved everything." On the other end of the line, he could hear Helen crying with joy, and in the background, Cole's voice asking what had happened. "He did it!" Helen shouted. "Richard did it! The project is going to continue!" That night, the 3 of them gathered again at Helen's apartment to celebrate. Cole had an important test the next day, but he couldn't study, he was so excited. Helen made Richard's favorite dish, the one she used to make when he was a child, and Richard, for the first time in decades, completely relaxed, allowing himself to just be happy. "You know what's funny?" Richard said, a glass of wine in his hand. "I spent my whole life building a successful company. I won awards, recognition, money. But nothing, absolutely nothing compares to this, to knowing that we're truly changing lives." "That's because this time it's not just about you, son," Helen said affectionately. "It's about us, about all of us." Cole raised his glass of soda. A toast to chosen family, to all the chosen families. The three of them toasted, and at that moment, looking at these two people who had transformed his life as much as he had transformed theirs, Richard finally understood the true meaning of success. It wasn't in spreadsheets or contracts. It was right there at that simple table, amidst laughter and tears, plans and memories, in a family that had chosen to exist against all odds. Outside, New York continued its frantic pace, but inside, time seemed to have slowed down, allowing three hearts to finally find what they had always been searching for: belonging, purpose, and unconditional love. Carnegie Hall was beautifully decorated for the official launch event of the Chosen Family Project. White and lilac flowers adorned the stage, and a large screen displayed stories of the successful matches. City officials, representatives from social organizations, journalists, and most importantly, the project participants, filled the historic theater's red velvet seats. Backstage, Richard was adjusting his tie for the 10th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from corporate nerves, but from an emotion he had learned to recognize and accept in recent months: genuine vulnerability. "You're going to do great, son." Helen appeared beside him, elegant in a light blue dress Richard had picked out for her. At 78, she radiated a vitality she hadn't shown in years. "What if I forget what I'm going to say? What if people don't understand how important this is?" Richard asked, a rare insecurity showing in his voice. "Then you speak from the heart. You tell the truth. How this project wasn't born from a business strategy, but from a lost son and an invisible mother, and a boy who taught us what really matters." Helen held her son's face in her hands. "You've changed, Richard, for the better, and people will feel that." Cole approached, wearing a suit Richard had had custom-made for him. The young man was almost unrecognizable. His hair was professionally cut, his face clean-shaven, his posture erect. But it was his eyes that drew the most attention. They shone with a confidence that hadn't existed before. "Are you ready?" Richard asked. "I'll never be totally ready to speak in front of this many people," Cole admitted with a nervous smile. "But I'm going to try, for all the Coles still out there sleeping under overpasses thinking they have no future." A stage manager appeared, signaling it was time. The three of them looked at each other, joining their hands in a circle. "Let's do this together," Richard said, "like everything that matters." The auditorium applauded as they walked onto the stage. Richard went to the podium, looking out at the full audience. He recognized faces: his partners, the project team, families that had been matched, representatives from the mayor's office. But mostly, he saw hope in the eyes of seniors who hadn't been matched yet, but were waiting for their chance. In the faces of young people watching from the balcony, dreaming of the possibility of a different life. "Good afternoon, everyone," Richard began, his voice amplified by the microphones. "My name is Richard Miller, and I'd like to start by admitting something. I was a lost man." An attentive silence fell over the theater. "I had professional success, money, recognition, but I had no real connection with the people who mattered most. My mother lived just a few blocks away, but she was further from me than if she were in another country. I visited her like someone checking off a task. I provided material comfort, but denied her the only comfort. That truly matters, presence." Richard looked at Helen, who was seated in the front row. She smiled encouragingly. "And then, 8 months ago, I witnessed a scene that would change everything. I saw my mother being helped by a young homeless man. My first reaction was suspicion, even anger. How dare that kid touch my mother? A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the audience. But my mother, this extraordinary woman who raised me alone, who sacrificed so much for me, had the courage to confront me. She told me something I carry with me to this day, that I had locked her in a golden prison, that she had everything except what she really needed. She had loneliness, she had walls, she had silence." Richard paused, feeling the emotion tighten his throat. That young man, Cole, had given her in days what I couldn't give her in years: genuine listening, true companionship, the feeling of being important in someone's life. And it was from that painful but necessary realization that Chosen Family was born. He gestured for Cole to join him on stage. The young man stood up, walking with a mix of nervousness and determination. "This is Cole Santos. He lost his parents when he was 8. He went through shelters where he was mistreated. He lived for 3 years on the streets of New York, sleeping under overpasses, working odd jobs, but never losing hope for a better future. And most importantly, never losing his humanity, his capacity to care, to love." The audience looked at Cole with renewed attention. Cole was the one who had the vision for this project, who saw that there are thousands of lonely seniors and thousands of unsupported young people, and that these two solitudes could meet and heal each other. Chosen. Family is not charity. It's an exchange. It's recognizing that family isn't defined by DNA, but by choice, by affection, by mutual commitment. Richard handed the microphone to Cole. The young man took a deep breath before speaking. "I was really scared to be here today," Cole began, his voice trembling slightly. "Not because of the cameras or the important people, but because for a long time I thought I didn't deserve to be in places like this, that my place was in the shadows, on the margins, forgotten." He looked at Helen and his voice gained firmness. "But Mrs. Helen taught me that everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves to have someone who cares. She took me in when I was nothing more than a dirty kid sitting in a park. She didn't judge me. She didn't pity me. She just saw me as a person." Tears began to stream down the faces of many in the audience. And Richard, he had the courage to admit he was wrong, that he needed to change. How many of us have that courage? He could have pushed me away from Mrs. Helen. He could have thrown me back on the street, but he chose to give me a chance, to give me a home, to give me hope. Cole wiped away his own tears. "Today I'm in school. I have a home. I have a family that chose to love me and that I chose to love back. And I want other young people like me to have the same chance. I want other seniors like Mrs. Helen to feel valued, needed, loved. That's why Chosen Family exists, to turn loneliness into connection, to turn absence into presence." The audience rose to a standing ovation. Cole, emotional, let Richard embrace him. And then Helen came up on stage, joining the two of them. "Can I say something?" she asked, taking the microphone. "Mum, you don't have to," Richard began, but she was already speaking. "I want to. I need to." Helen looked out at the audience. "I'm Helen Miller. I'm 78 years old. I was married for 10 years before my husband left us. I worked for 30 years as a seamstress to raise my son alone. And when I could finally rest, when I finally had comfort and security, I discovered I had everything except a reason to wake up every day." Her voice was firm, filled with a moving dignity. "My son loved me. I always knew that, but he didn't know how to show it. He thought that by giving me a nice apartment, a nurse, security, he was doing his part. And he was, but not completely. Because a mother's heart doesn't just need security, it needs connection." She looked at Cole. This boy, whom society had discarded, who lived invisibly on the streets, was the one who made me feel visible again. He was the one who listened to me tell stories no one else wanted to hear. He was the one who made me laugh, made me feel important, made me remember that I still have so much to offer the world. Helen held Richard's hand with one hand and Cole's with the other. "We're a strange family, aren't we? A workaholic businessman who learned to feel, a lonely widow who learned to live again, and a homeless young man who learned to dream. But we are a real family, and we've proven that this is what family is. People who choose to walk together, to care for each other, to grow together." The applause was deafening. When it finally subsided, Richard returned to the microphone. "Chosen Family has already connected 15 pairs in New York City. We have 50 more in the screening process. And starting today, with the support of the city and our partner organizations, we will be expanding to other cities. Our goal is to serve 500 families in the next year." He showed a video on the screen, testimonials from seniors and young people who had been matched. An 81-year-old woman who was now teaching crochet to a 20-year-old girl. A 75-year-old widower who found in a 19-year-old boy the grandson he never had, and together they restored classic cars. Each story was unique, but they all shared the same denominator: love that transcended social expectations. After the video, Richard opened the floor for questions. Journalists raised their hands, but it was a voice from the audience that caught everyone's attention. An elderly woman with a cane stood up, trembling. "I lost my husband 3 years ago. My children live far away. I wake up every day not knowing why. Can I sign up?" Richard stepped down from the stage and walked over to her, taking her hand. "Yes, ma'am, you can. What's your name?" Annabelle Smith." "Mrs. Smith, you'll be getting a call from us this week, and we're going to find someone who will value every story you have to tell, every experience you've lived, every piece of wisdom you carry." The woman broke down in tears, and Richard hugged her. That's when it happened. A wave of emotion swept through the theatre. Other seniors stood up, wanting to sign up. Young people from the audience also came forward. The event, which was supposed to be purely institutional, transformed into something much bigger, into a movement, into a quiet revolution of affection. The project team quickly organized, handing out forms, scheduling interviews. What was supposed to last 2 hours stretched into 5. Richard, Cole, and Helen spoke with every person who wanted to talk, listening to stories, offering hope. When the theatre finally emptied, it was already night. The 3 of them were exhausted, but radiant. "I think it worked," Cole said with a huge smile. "It did more than work," Richard replied. "We touched hearts. We changed perspectives." Helen sat in one of the empty theatre seats, looking at the stage where just hours before they had told their story. "You know what's most beautiful," she said. "It's that every person who signed up today will get the chance I got, the chance to be seen, to be heard, to matter in someone's life." Richard sat next to his mother and Cole sat on her other side. There, in the red seats of Carnegie Hall, under the lights that were beginning to dim, they sat in silence for a moment. It was a comfortable silence, full of gratitude and fulfillment. "Mom," Richard said finally, "thank you for running away that day, for having the courage to confront me, for not giving up on me." "Son, I would never give up on you, just like you didn't give up on changing." Helen kissed his forehead, as she did when he was a child. "And Cole," Richard turned to the young man, "thank you for taking care of my mother when I didn't know how, for seeing in her what I was too blind to see, and for having the courage to dream up this project, to believe it was possible." Cole wiped away a tear. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, for giving me a chance when I had nothing, for proving that there's still kindness in the world, and that family is so much more than blood." The 3 of them hugged right there, in the empty theatre, united by a love that had been born from chaos, pain, and loneliness, but had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. In the following months, Chosen Family continued to grow. Partnerships were formed with other cities. Universities began to study the model. TV shows ran features on it, but for Richard, Cole, and Helen, the most important thing was the lives being transformed. Every letter they received from participants thanking them, every photo of new families smiling together, every story of loneliness conquered by affection. Cole finished his GED with excellent scores. He was accepted into a public university for architecture, fulfilling the dream he had carried since childhood. He continued to live with Helen, who refused to let him go, saying she finally had the grandson she always wanted. Richard restructured his life. He remained at the head of his company, but with different priorities. He reserved weekends for his family. He had dinner with his mother and Cole at least 3 times a week. He closely followed each new project match, getting to know the new families personally. And a funny thing happened. The more he opened up emotionally, the more he invested in real human connections, the more his company prospered. Employees noticed the change and felt inspired. Clients valued a company with a purpose beyond profit. Chosen Family had become not just a social project, but part of the identity of Miller Consulting. One evening, almost a year after the official launch, the 3 were at Helen's apartment, celebrating Cole's birthday. 21. He had asked only for a simple party, with the people who really mattered. Besides the 3 of them, some of the pairs who had been connected by the project were there. Annabelle Smith, the woman who had signed up during the event, was there with Lucas, the 20-year-old who now lived with her and helped her with her garden while he studied agriculture. Mr. George, the widower who restored cars, was there with Tiago, laughing at some inside joke only they understood. The room was filled with laughter, overlapping conversations, palpable affection. It was an extended family, formed not by blood but by choice and love. When it was time to blow out the candles on the cake, Cole looked around at all these people who a year ago were strangers and were now his family. "I'm not going to make a wish," he said, "because everything I could possibly wish for I already have. I have a home, I have people who love me, I have dreams that are now possible, I have a purpose. I just want to say thank you to every person in this room for proving that miracles exist, and sometimes they happen in the most unexpected places." He looked specifically at Helen and Richard, "and especially to you two, for teaching me that I deserved love, that I deserved chances, that my past didn't define my future." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. As Cole blew out the candles to applause, Richard felt a peace he had never experienced before. This was true success, not in awards or recognition, but in these people gathered together, in these transformed lives, in this love that grew and multiplied. Later, after the guests had left and Cole was in his room studying, Richard and Helen stood on the balcony looking out at the city that had witnessed them change so much. "Are you happy, son?" Helen asked. Richard thought for a moment before answering. "You know, Mom, I thought I knew what happiness was. I thought it was closing a big deal or watching the company's numbers grow. But I found out I was wrong. Happiness is this. It's being here with you, knowing Cole is in there, safe and loved. It's knowing we helped create dozens of families just like ours. It's finally learning what really matters." Helen held her son's hand. "I always knew you'd get here. You just needed the right time and the right person to show you the way." "Cole changed our lives just as much as we changed his," Richard admitted. "That's how love works, son. It's not a one-way street. When we truly love, everyone is transformed." They stood there in comfortable silence, mother and son, looking at the city lights. Two hearts that had been lost and found each other again. Two souls who learned that it's never too late to start over, to reconnect, to choose love over fear. And somewhere in that same city, in apartments scattered across different boroughs, other chosen families were having their own conversations, creating their own memories, weaving their own bonds of affection. Seniors rediscovering purpose, young people finding hope, solitudes being conquered by the courage to open one's heart. Chosen Family had started as the story of three unlikely people, but it had grown to be so much more than that. It was a movement, a quiet revolution, proof that when we choose to see each other with compassion, when we decide to extend a hand instead of closing a fist, when we understand that family is about choice and not obligation, the world becomes a little better. One home at a time, one heart at a time, one chosen family at a time. And it had all begun with an unexpected encounter on a misty afternoon on Park Avenue, with a lonely mother, a lost son, and an invisible young man who dared to be seen. Three lives that intertwined, and in doing so, showed that the strongest bonds are not always the ones born of blood, but the ones we choose to create with courage, vulnerability, and unconditional love.